Welcome to this final session of the retreat, what is usually called the Bishop's Charge. And so it is, because although I'm continuing in Ephesians, this is pretty clearly instruction to those coming into ordination. And it's serious stuff. It's based, of course, from Ephesians 5. We've been going through Ephesians. I would like to, for the sake of this event anyway, change the position of the chapter numbers. These things were added later. It's not Paul's doing the chapter divisions. We're talking today about chapter 5, verse 1, up to 6, verse 9. I do think that is one chunk of the book. I think the other chapter divisions are fine, but chapter 5 should include the first 9 verses of chapter 6. And then chapter 6, verse 10 onwards, I won't give away too much if I suggest that that might be where the sermon is coming from in the ordination service, from Bishop John for the deacons and from myself for the priests. We'll each preach on the second part of Ephesians chapter 6. But in chapter 5, if you want a bishop's charge, here are some charges, some instructions. Verse 1, be imitators of God. Verse 2, live in love. Verse 6, let no one deceive you. Verse 15, be careful then how you live. Verse 21, be subject to one another. And there are all sorts of lesser commands and instructions in Ephesians 5, some of which are controversial or it could be taken as difficult, particularly things about wives and possibly about children and possibly about slaves, all raising difficulties in our modern world. And again, we need to get our doctrine of Scripture right, and we need to understand and work out what's going on in these sometimes difficult passages. Why are they difficult? Are they difficult because Paul is saying something that goes against the grain and we just don't like? Are they difficult because they only really apply to the world Paul was writing to and not to our world? Are they difficult because we've learnt better than the first century? Are they difficult because, why are they difficult? Well, ask yourself. I was taught a very long time ago when I was a teenager, but it's still true and absolutely true. When you come across difficulties in the Bible, or whenever you're reading the Bible, there are 3 simple questions to ask in this order. What does it say? What does it mean? How does it apply? And very often when people don't like what Scripture says, they are starting with the wrong question. How does it apply? How does it work out today? What's this mean for us now? Instead of starting with, what does it say? What does it mean? That is, what does it mean to its first hearers? And then how does it apply to us? And we need to do that work, going back and saying, what does it say? What's it mean? Before we start saying, I don't like what it sounds like for today. Really tricky question to deal with there. And ultimately, what does it mean for us to be under the authority of Scripture? You've got to work on that one. Well, a lot of Ephesians 5 is about our moral behavior, and that is important. Who we are is important. Some clergy worry, and some people thinking about ordination worry about being in a goldfish bowl and your life being subject to public review. Yes, it is. There's no distinction between your private and public life. You're allowed privacy to some extent, but your lifestyle is subject to the promises you make in ordination and subject to the discipline of the church. And that is how it is. There's no question about it. The rules for clergy discipline and the possibilities for all of us of being disciplined for behavior that's inappropriate includes behavior in your private life just as much as what you do when you're in church or when you're dressed up to look like a minister. What you do on holiday, what you do in your relationships, what you do on your day off is still part of who you are as a deacon, as a priest, as a bishop, and still subject to the discipline of the church. There is no distinction. And if you think that you can behave outside public ministry in ways which are inappropriate for public ministry, think again and do it quickly. People talk about, should politicians be allowed a private life? Should others be allowed a private life? And there's a general assumption, increasingly, yes. It's interesting because a few generations ago, the general assumption was, no, if a politician misbehaved in his or her private life, that was the end of their public life. That seems to have disappeared. Hasn't disappeared in the church, and it shouldn't, and it won't. Because we're called to be ambassadors, models, ministers, representatives, imitators of God. And that's part of our calling in ministry. It's part of every Christian's calling, but particularly those who live as ministers and public ministers of the church. It's absolutely part of our calling. So, verse 3, things we may not want to hear: fornication, impurity, greed must not even be mentioned among you, obscene, silly, vulgar talk, etc. And don't be deceived about this, for because of these things, the wrath of God comes on those who are disobedient. We're back to pre-Christianity stuff. We're back to before God's grace brought us into the fellowship of his people. We're warned. We're warned. Once you were darkness, but now, verse 8, now in the Lord you're light. Live as children of light. Try to find out what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to mention what such people do secretly, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible. There's warning, isn't there? A very clear warning about our moral behavior, which includes our speech. That's what we're called to. We're called to outward purity as well as inward purity, like it or not. So verse 15, be careful then how you live. And in a sense, that's my charge to you now, dear brothers and sisters. Be careful how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise. Not because I'm looking for trouble or difficulty or because I want to make life hard for you, but I want you, verse 15, to understand what the will of the Lord is. Do not get drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit, as you sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Yet you've got to give up some of the ways of the world if you haven't done so already. If they're things which aren't appropriate or proper for a Christian to be doing or thinking or saying, then stop. We move on to a slight change of pace in verse 21, but it's very much the same, because this is talking now about our relationships with those we're closest to. As a public matter, our relationships are a public matter if we're Christian ministers. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. That could be the heading of the whole chapter. There are one or two silly Bible commentators who ask the question, does verse 21 refer to the previous part of the chapter, behave well, be careful how you live? Or is it a heading for the next part of the chapter where you've got wives and husbands and children and parents and slaves and masters? No, of course it's referring to both. Of course it is. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ is a great summary of what this chapter is all about. That we serve one another, therefore we're not going to behave badly, and we serve one another, therefore we're going to behave particularly well in our personal relationships. And when it says wives be subject to your husbands, and that creates problems, and we talk about the headship thing which creates problems, got to go back to the first century, see how this would have been heard and read by his first hearers before we ask what it means for us now. You've got to do that job. But wives be subject to your husbands is in the context of be subject to one another. It isn't saying there that wives have to do something that husbands don't have to do. We have to be subject to one another. And that's the heading. And husbands have to put that into practice as well in the way that they love their wives. And then the same applies, and then let's talk about marriage, and marriage as a picture of the church, and that's a wonderful thing, and we can't go into that now. But as I said last time, Paul moves from doctrine to practice, and he never leaves the doctrine of marriage and the doctrine of the unity of the church. Christ and the church is one and the same thing, or at least we learn from one about the other and from the other about the one, and it's a reciprocal bit of practical doctrine. We don't escape doctrine, I hope. And then we get children and parents, which is all about being subject to one another. Children, obeying your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Fathers, I think that means fathers and mothers, don't provoke your children. It's being subject to one another, always seeking the best for the other. Slaves and masters. Now, of course, we talk about slavery. It is clear in the New Testament that Jesus and Paul would like slavery to be got rid of, but it's there in the society they live in. They're not seeking to revolutionize the way society operates at that level, but they're looking for slaves to behave well to their masters and masters to behave well to their slaves. For you know that both of you have the same master in heaven. That's the first thing to say to those who have slaves or servants or employees, or however we would put it today. Treat those who are under you well. Now, as a deacon or a curate, there might not be many under you, but it applies to young people, it applies to those in confirmation classes, it applies to those coming to you asking for baptism or marriage or spiritual wisdom or help. Treat people well. Understand as ministers that there is a huge power dynamic, and once you put this collar thing on, people will see you differently, for good or for ill, but they will, and they do. And one of the issues we sometimes have in safeguarding and in other areas of the church's life is that clergy forget or never realize that just wearing one of these gives you immense power in the way people see you. And that can create difficulties. If you don't understand the power dynamic in the way people see a minister as a bit different from others, then you've got to start learning that very, very quickly. Don't say the answer is to stop wearing collars. The fact that you are who you are, you're ordained minister of the church, means that people will see you differently. You may not like it, tough, that's how it is. You've been called by God to be a minister in the church, and therefore you have to live and be seen to live to an exemplary standard. And that means treating people well in all your relationships. In your marriage relationship, however private you wish that to be, you will treat one another absolutely, purely and appropriately. In terms of relationships with children, with parents, with slaves, with employees, with those under you, with those over you, your relationships will be pure and wholesome. That's a strange thing for me to be saying as your ordination charge. I'm not talking about how to do your ministry. I'm talking about how to live as a Christian, a public Christian, because what ordination does is it makes you a public Christian. Now, there's plenty of stuff you will find and you have heard and you will hear about how to do your ministry. I've chosen today, and Ephesians has led me, but it's my choice to use this opportunity in the bishop's charge to tell you, be careful how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise. Ordination changes the way people see us, and therefore we must attend to our lifestyle and make sure that our lifestyle is pure and wholesome and is what honors Christ and what honors his church. The Lord bless you.